Perfect timing, Hillary. All right, so with that, why don't we get started? I'm going to share my screen. And this is kind of a bittersweet for me because this is probably one of the last times that I'm going to be doing something like this. So let's have some fun. All right. So we're talking all about systems strategic planning. And like I mentioned, everything I'm going to talk about today is in the toolkit. So you don't have to panic with trying to capture all the details and notes. It's all there. What I want you to do today is just try to absorb kind of at a high level. Here's the process. Here's some of the key tips to keep in mind. And then you can always go back into the toolkit to really get into more details and really think carefully about how to apply it. So this is just kind of giving you a big picture overview so that you know where to navigate. So there's 3 things we're going to talk about today. What is a systems strategic plan? What's a process you could use to design this thing? And the bulk of what we're going to focus on are several tips that come from the research and the literature on systems change for how do you design really powerful strategies. So these are the 3 buckets. Again, everything is in the toolkit. So just kind of focus on absorbing and grabbing a big picture today. The slides I can also make the slides available, Jillian. So yes, stay tuned. All right, so what is a systems strategic plan? One way to think about this is it's an evolving plan. It's not something you just make and put on the shelf. It's something that changes as you start to implement and learn more. So it's an evolving plan that focuses on collective cross-sector strategies, not just a single strategy by any one individual organization or just the hub. It's collective. And most importantly, that plan focuses on addressing the system root causes that you identified through your regional system assessment that are affecting Raise Up Oregon objectives. So here's the main takeaway, and this is a good point to bring up with your hub partners, is the system strategic plan focuses on programs, but it is not the focus of the plan. It is but one aspect of what this is focused on. Because if you remember, all the different types of root causes that you had in your regional system assessment go way beyond just what is inside of a program. It's all this stuff. And so, again, what's different, this is not just a program plan. This is a systems change plan. And that has to take into account all of these different things that we know affect the way that systems operate. So this system strategic plan is again part of that learning cycle, action learning cycle that we talked about a long time ago, where you understand through something like a regional system assessment, what is the landscape of issues, what's helping and hindering our objectives. Then you design strategies to address them and test them out. This systems strategic plan fits in that design phase that then prepares you to start launching, testing, implementing in a continuous cycle so you can learn if those strategies are starting to make a difference, and if needed, redesign them so they are. Okay, so what does this actually look like? What's like a process that you could use to design these strategies for the plan? Here's a really simple process that you see a lot in the design thinking world. There's 4 pieces to it. First, you get lots of different people to ideate, brainstorm, come up with ideate system strategy ideas grounded in those root causes. You get them to review bright spots in your community, things that are already working to address those root causes that people might not even realize are really good ideas, as well as other examples we see across the state, across the country, internationally, to kind of enhance the ideated strategies. Then you look at all your strategies and you prioritize which ones make the most sense for us to focus on. There's a criteria in the toolkit that you can use. And then you take those prioritized strategies and flesh them out a little bit. so they kind of stand alone and you can communicate better. Then you vet them with end users. They could be people who are going to literally be carrying out aspects of the strategies. They can also be families who will ultimately benefit from those strategies to make sure that, hey, did we get this right? We make a lot of assumptions in strategy design. We have to always vet them out to make sure they're going to work, they're going to resonate with people, and there's no additional retooling that needs to happen. So again, in your toolkit, there are detailed descriptions of ideas for how you facilitate something like this. Kind of diagrams even of how you might have people use sticky notes, how you might look at bright spots, etc. So there's a lot of very detailed instructions in here for how you bring a group through something like this. So go back after this video, after our time today, and look at the toolkit, and you'll have a lot more details on how this works. As you think about this process, one important consideration is, who do you engage? So what we know is that most groups across the country typically engage small, kind of select groups of leaders, kind of behind closed doors, so to speak. Now, what do you think the limitation to this is? Just think about it for a second. What we know is that if you limit strategy design to kind of a select group of people, usually fairly homogeneous, it's constrained by the assumptions, the experiences, the biases of those decision makers. It's like putting a ceiling on your strategy design that's capped at sort of the range of imagination and considerations of those people. In contrast, the research shows that if you engage a more diverse range of perspectives in strategy design, especially families from priority populations, it leads to often more effective strategies because it's more responsive to people's needs, both family members' needs, as well as people in the system who are going to be carrying out your strategy. It responds to regional context that people have a broader understanding of. They're often more creative, and it often creates better community partnerships through the design process. So there's lots of benefits to increasing this. In fact, one of the key areas that you might expand this to is like a parent leadership council, because they have a deep understanding of some of the aspects here, including direct staff, who again have a really good pulse on how some of these root causes are operating, as well as out-of-the-box thinkers, even from other sectors, who can just infuse your strategy design process with new ideas, new thinking. So this is up to you. Each hub gets to decide this. But again, what the research tells us is if you can push and expand the boundary around who you engage, it often leads to better strategy ideas. All right, so let's get to the tips. Again, this is kind of like the bulk of what I want to talk to you about. Before I get there, any questions on anything that I just covered in terms of the process? Okay. If you do, throw them in the chat and I will see them. All right, so here are the 4 strategy design tips. And again, these are from a lot of theory and research and the literature on systems change, community change, collaborative operating kind of change. And so here's what they are. First is shift root causes, and not just one root cause, but a series of root causes. Design strategies to advance equity. Design self-sustaining strategies. And tend the soil for implementation. We're going to touch on each of these. I'm going to describe them, and you're going to have a chance to apply them to an example. So if you notice the orange letters, it creates the acronym REST. Now, why do you think I chose REST for the acronym for powerful strategy design? Other than it worked really well with the words in the tips. I chose it because, yeah, go slow to move forward. That's exactly it, Shira. So by designing better strategies, we're going to deal with some of the exhausting system dysfunction that makes our jobs more onerous, and it makes children and families' lives incredibly difficult. And so if we work smarter, not harder, it's going to allow us just to have a little bit more breathing room when it comes to doing really good work. And yes, Chris, because we are exhausted. And part of the reason we're exhausted is because the systems are exhausting. And so starting to deal with these really important root causes in ways that creates more sustainable change will allow all of us a little bit more rest. Active rest, we'll say that. All right, so let's get into the first one. Shift root causes. We've talked about root causes a lot, but again, one way to think about it is root causes are conditions that explain why a problem is happening, or in the case of Raise Up Oregon, why an objective is not yet being met in your region. And the good news is through this regional system assessment process, your hub already identified and prioritized root causes for your region, specifically around Raise Up Oregon Objective 2, right? Here's just a picture. This looks similar to many hubs' root cause summaries. So there's 3 things you got to do with root causes to design strategies. One is you got to clarify the who, what, where with your prioritized root causes. You have to look and reveal, are there any underlying root causes kind of going on here that we need to take into consideration? And 3, you need to design strategies to address multiple root causes, almost creating a chain reaction going up to your issue. So we're going to go through, all 3. We're going to start with the first one. So here's an issue. Many families can't find or access early care and education childcare, even when it is available in the region. One of the root causes is that many organizational leaders aren't authentically engaging families in decision-making about how to improve the early childhood system, how to structure it, how to improve it. So as you look at this, what do you think might need to be clarified around that root cause? Use the chat, take 10 seconds. What do you think needs to be clarified? Who, what, where? Yep, perfect. You guys are nailing it. Okay, the first one, Dorothy and Chris said right away. Who are these organizational leaders that aren't authentically engaging families? Where do they work? Who are they? Yeah, you guys are rocking in the chat. Here's another one that came up. Well, which families? We're talking about all families or particular families? And finally, which decisions exactly and about what? How to improve the early childhood system is kind of a big umbrella, right? So what specifically are we looking at here? This helps to really hone in and notice how it's going to be linked to that issue. The way you answer these questions should directly link to how this is affecting the root cause is affecting that issue above. So for example, here's the one kind of vague aspect of that root cause. Many organizational leaders, just like you all said in the chat, well, who are we talking about? So maybe a hub gets together and they really think about this, they answer the question and they realize, it's really leaders within school districts, CCRNRs, and the Hub Governance Council. There may be many other leaders, but part of this is also prioritizing where do we want to start. Okay, which families aren't included? We're going to focus on the hub's priority populations because that seems to make the most sense for our issue and our ultimate objective. In what decision making? Well, if we're looking at that issue above and it has to do with access, we're going to specifically focus this on how to design coordinated enrollment processes and how to make sure information about available childcare slots, how to access it, et cetera, how to navigate it is actually reaching priority families. So you can imagine doing this same process with some of the root causes that you identified through your RSA. In that toolkit, there's a link to a separate handout that has 2 other examples of root causes that are go through the same process, the clarifying process. So take a look at that if you want some more examples of this. But essentially, you're just asking the questions who, what, where, how, to really kind of flesh out and prioritize where do we want to focus? Where do we want to start? Once you do that, then you're ready to reveal potential underlying root causes that are driving that root cause. So here's our root cause that we just clarified. Here, the little details are in small print. So you might ask yourself, well, why is it that people in those settings aren't engaging families in these types of decisions? Like, why is this happening? Take just a second to imagine in your region, what might be some of the reasons why organizational leaders aren't always authentically engaging families in decision-making? Just imagine. Some of the things that I've seen come up in your RSAs, as well as other communities across the country, are the following. Some leaders aren't so happy or comfortable about sharing decision-making influence with families. They kind of like having all the decision-making power. That's a mindset. Some leaders don't have the skills they need to authentically engage families. There's many areas that this could include. Just it's simple like engagement practices. There could be implicit biases happening. There could be other types of skill areas that they don't have. Similarly, some parents might need some additional skills to really like powerfully play leadership roles in meetings like this, communication skills, advocacy skills, etc. And as came up, I think, in every RSA I looked at, many decision-making meetings, both within the hub as well as other types of settings like CCR&R, school districts, etc., aren't always held at times or locations that are accessible. And there aren't always supports available, like childcare, transportation, etc., to help families actually engage. So here are 4 underlying root causes that this hypothetical hub has identified leading to that root cause. Now, just think about this for a moment. If you were to just focus on that first root cause and design strategies, you might make a lot of assumptions about what to focus on. Think how different your strategy design process, that ideation process we were talking about a little bit before, think how different your strategies might look if you were focusing also on these underlying root causes. It just allows you to hone in and get very specific and clear and targeted on what your strategy is trying to change, so that we don't accidentally, unintentionally make a lot of assumptions and like target the wrong stuff. So these underlying root causes really, again, help to hone in your strategy design process on exactly what's going on in this situation. Okay, so once you've really identified some critical underlying root causes, then you get to have fun and figure out, how do we address all of these things? So there's 2 tips here. As you're designing strategies to address root causes, you want to look for twofers, spots where you can address multiple root causes with the same strategy. And you want to create a chain reaction, which means you're addressing multiple root causes all the way up to the issue that it's linked to. So here's an example of a twofer. Here's our issue, root cause, and underlying root causes. A twofer could be to develop separate but aligned trainings for both system leaders and parent leaders that are focused on those skills and mindsets that they still need to develop. An example of a chain reaction would be to add on to that first strategy by using strategies to address some of the other root causes. So maybe you're going to address this other root cause over there with making decision-making opportunities more accessible. You're going to address that top level root cause by using an assessment to make sure that power is actually being shared, and if not, dealing with it. And even going all the way up to the issue to make sure that you're getting feedback from parents to see if some of those new processes are working, that they're able to actually find early care and education childcare, given some of the changes that have been made. So chain reaction twofers. So what does this look like live? Let's talk about what it actually how it might play out in a hub. You can basically look at your root causes and have your hub partners start with like 2 to 3 of your prioritized root causes. And I would try to pick root causes, at least initially, that are from like the same issue area, because it can be easier to identify twofers and chain reactions if they're kind of at least related to the same issue. You create breakout groups. You could create breakout groups, have a facilitator, and have each breakout group look at those root causes, clarify the who, what, where, reveal underlying root causes, and come up with some initial strategy ideas. And then the facilitator in that conversation could be capturing those ideas on a flip chart if you're in person, or on a PowerPoint slide or a Jamboard or whatever if it's virtual. But just have breakout groups like really kind of go through this process. Then you could have those breakout groups share their ideas with the rest of the group, put all the flip charts on a wall, or put the PowerPoint slides together, have the group integrate similar strategy ideas if there are any, and have them look for additional twofers and additional chain reactions. And again, you can be taking live notes in this conversation to be adjusting, expanding the strategies, but you're basically allowing people to look at kind of like a range of strategies that can address multiple things. Okay, pause. Any questions about addressing root causes? The first tip that we've just gone through. Yeah, Athena, go for it.
I think my first question that comes to mind is, while we're coming up with strategies and things like that, should there be guardrails in place that keep it focused on what they can do as an organization or things like that? Because while there may be a lot of strategies that come up, we may not have any groups or organizations that can lead that work.
Yep. One of the prioritizing criteria listed in the toolkit is, do we currently have the capacity to launch this strategy, or could we feasibly build it through partnerships, through other ways of kind of like working differently? So I think that's an important question, Athena, but I find oftentimes people get like artificially limited by fear, and just thinking inside their own organization versus thinking outside the box to consider other organizations, other types of people in the region that could help bulk up the capacity. So yes, with a grain of salt, like I always like to push people a little bit to dream, could you feasibly build this, or partner or work differently in ways that would build that capacity. But yeah, you want to be realistic. I mean, you're not going to like go to the moon, but you also want to be ambitious enough so it's actually going to make a difference, and it's going to like attract people's energy and motivation. Shira, you had mentioned going back 2 slides. Is this the slide that you wanted?
Actually, no, I was looking for the slide where you were, I was taking notes where you had, look at the root causes, the breakout room groups, facilitator, look at the root causes. Yep.
This one?
Thank you. Yep.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, Chris, is there a timeline? Many of our convening groups take July and or August off. Oh, summertime. I think the timeline is something that each hub needs to negotiate. And it may require you all to think creatively as well about maybe rethinking some of the typical meeting processes that frankly aren't always aligned with the work, with how systems change actually works. So if there's a lot of time between the next time you meet, you might think about ways to engage them, or just kind of backwalk. So the Molly, the strategic plan deliverable is due in November, this coming November. So if you think about, how do you backwalk from that due date to have enough touch points for your partners to ideate some strategies prioritize them, and then vet them with some folks. You just want to kind of make sure there's enough time. And note that the November deadline in the broad scheme of things is arbitrary in the like lifetime of your systems change work. But you do want to get like a good kind of set of strategies so that across all hubs we can kind of see where the hub's focused. How can we start to create some twofers with what strategies are coming out? But you can continually vet strategies and adapt them after November. You should, but you know, you want to think how many meetings, how many touch points do we need with hub partners to get this in a good enough place by November? Okay, I'm gonna suggest we do some of the deliverable timeliney stuff behind the scenes. Just because I'm going to keep going through so we get through all our content. Hillary is going to be the guru for all of that. Jillian asked a great question. Will I be available for questions as we progress through the work? To some degree, but my contract officially ends at the end of June. And so use me hard for the next couple weeks, folks. And then I can do some, you know, questions if you have something about the content. I'd be more than happy to respond over email, but I won't have the same kind of intensive coaching relationship that we've had over the last year and a half. But to be determined how some of those supports might come into work. Stay tuned. I think Belk is thinking about different ways to support the hubs moving forward around this work. Okay, I'm going to keep going. So our next tip is about advancing equity. So here's the bottom line. Lots of groups across the country are trying to advance equity with their efforts. Unfortunately, despite their good efforts, many of those efforts actually don't achieve the results they're trying to, and sometimes they even make inequities worse. Like, how is that possible? You have a lot of well-intentioned people working very hard. What is going on? So how is it that some strategies could actually make inequities worse? So let's say you have a strategy and you track it over time and you track evaluation results for that strategy, whatever it is, and you find that on average, it's making outcomes for kids and families better. So after looking at results like this, people often celebrate. They're like, hooray, it's a successful strategy. However, if you separate out different people in a region, if you disaggregate it, oftentimes what you see is that there's some families, let's say families with more resources, who are benefiting a whole lot more than everyone else. And there's actually increased social inequity that is happening, even though everyone is technically benefiting. So take a look. See that average? It's kind of like masking what's actually going on, which is a huge plug for disaggregating your data always, because it tells a much more clear story. So again, it's not necessarily that this strategy is bad. It just wasn't designed in a way to advance equity. And so how do you do that? Here's four questions that you can keep in mind as you design strategies, as you and your partners design strategies to ensure you're advancing equity. The first one is, how can you ensure these strategies will ultimately reach your priority populations, given their unique needs and circumstances? Now note, sometimes this could involve reach, doesn't necessarily need to be like programs reaching families. It could also be some of the changes that you're making. Are they going to affect the types of settings that will reach families? So if you're trying to focus on improving, for example, quality or improving other types of accessibility, but you're only focusing on settings, childcare settings, let's say, that are reaching kind of a subset of families without focusing on other childcare programs that might be reaching more priority population settings, again, you're going to fall into that trap of creating more social inequity. So you have to think really carefully, will this strategy equitably reach priority populations given their unique needs, unique circumstances. Similarly, will those strategies ultimately benefit those populations? Sometimes it's not enough just to reach people. They have to be designed in ways that are actually going to meet their unique needs and circumstances. This is not always a given. Third, you can ask yourself, are these strategies going to create any unintended consequences for our priority populations? How are we going to manage this? So, for example, one unintended consequence you see across the country is that states and other kind of entities have increased expectations for high quality childcare. That's a good thing, right? However, home-based care settings, often in low-resourced communities, don't have the capital, the financial resources, the capital. They need to buy materials or hire staff or meet some of the other high-quality standards. But their ability to qualify for publicly funded slots and reimbursement often depends on their quality rating. And so since a lot of families in low-resourced communities rely on publicly funded slots, makes it harder for those home-based settings in those communities to make enough profits to stay viable. It's like a vicious cycle. And so the strategy of increasing quality expectations was a good one. It just had the unintended consequence of disadvantaging child care settings with less capital. So to make this strategy better, you would add additional supports to make sure that those home-based childcare providers had enough capital and resources to actually meet those high quality standards. So they were on like more of an even playing field. Yes, and absolutely with what Athena said, there's a whole host of issues around how you even define high quality. I know Molly Day has put a lot of work into this as well. That doesn't necessarily take into account cultural responsivity. That's really kind of the number 2 bar. Finally, will your strategies increase priority population social, economic, and political power and capacity? So you might say like, well, what the heck? Why did you add this on the list? Because we know that in order to empower families, youth, communities to thrive, they need this type of power and capacity. It's kind of like an ethical obligation to continually build up and support and advance the power and capacity of priority populations. Okay, so here's 4 questions that as you ask them in strategy design, it can just kind of like allow the group to focus more on how can we simultaneously design this to advance equity. There's 2 other approaches that I just want to alert people to. You might have already heard of them. Who's heard of targeted universalism? Anyone on the call? I see some nods. So targeted universalism was developed by this sweet guy named John Powell. He doesn't even capitalize his name. That's how sweet he is. So targeted universalism basically says, okay, let's start with the priority populations in mind. How do we design this strategy so it takes into account their unique needs and constraints? Start there. Then once you have some strategies designed, you step back and say, how can we expand upon that strategy to simultaneously benefit as many other people as possible? But you start with the targeted, I won't use that word. You start with the priority population so that at the end of the day, you know the strategies are going to reach and benefit them and not have unintended consequences. Then you expand out. Typically, the way people design strategies is the other way around. They design for everyone a universal strategy that often doesn't meet the needs and constraints of priority populations. So targeted universalism kind of like flips that. Again, those questions and that approach, along with some resources, are in the toolkit. Another approach that you see comes from design thinking. It's called disruptive thinking. Basically, it's how do you think outside the box in terms of who's carrying out the strategy, where that strategy is happening, when it's happening, and how it's happening. And thinking outside the box specifically in ways that can better reach, benefit priority families and prevent unintended consequences, as well as build their power and capacity. So does it always have to be professionals carrying out strategies? Or could others in the community do it as well, including priority families? Where should we hold decision-making meetings? Should they be in offices, or should they be in like churches and neighborhood settings, and libraries that are easier for families to access, et cetera? So again, some good questions are in the toolkit just to help hub partners push themselves to think different and kind of flip the status quo, the scripts we typically use to design strategies, to consider, are there ways to advance equity in different ways by thinking outside the box? Okay, here's your practice. Here are our root causes from the prior tip. I want you to look at strategy 1. That was all about designing separate but aligned trainings for the system leaders and parent leaders to help build their skills around engaging parents and or engaging with professionals and shifting some mindsets. So as you look at that first strategy, think about all of the ideas with this tip around advancing equity we just talked about. How might you enhance strategy 1 to better advance equity? Think about that for just a couple seconds. If you have any ideas, you can put them in the chat. All right, so here's one you may have come up with. What if instead of just having hub partners develop those trainings, you co-design them with parent leaders and actually have parent leaders help co-facilitate them, so that it's really owned. That way it's more likely to benefit parent leaders, and it also simultaneously builds the power and capacity. You also can hold them at accessible times and locations that parents from priority populations can access. Absolutely, Athena had some of the same ideas in her chat. Make sure that there's childcare provided and it's accessible for rural communities as well. So you can kind of think about this for the other strategies as well. Think about number 2, strategy 2, make decision-making opportunities more accessible. So you just want to make sure that that's targeted universalism. It's targeted not just to any parent, but specifically to priority populations, and then expand so other families can access as well. Look at strategy 3. So this was about using an assessment to make sure power was being shared. Well, hey, let's co-design that assessment with parents. So we make sure that it's actually targeting what they need and their experience. And then do targeted outreach with parents so they know about decision-making opportunities and they can engage. Don't assume that they're going to be able to know about them or be able to access them. Make sure that connection is in place. Because what we know from the literature is families with more resources that could include money, time, social connections to kind of like mainstream information sources often hoard opportunities more so than families that don't have as many resources. And so again, targeted universalism, focus on how do we ensure that these benefits, these opportunities are reaching and benefiting the families in your priority populations, and then also available to other families as well. And finally, again, just targeting strategy 4 so that it's specific on priority populations. Okay, so how do you take this live? Similar to how we talked about with the root cause tip, have breakout groups pick a strategy and think about how to enhance it to better advance equity. Think about those tips that we just talked about. Bring those breakout groups back, have them share their ideas. Maybe there's things that they inspire in each other, and do kind of exactly what we just did here, where you're literally editing your strategies to add in a focus on equity. Now here's a special tip. You don't just have to do this with your new system strategic plan strategies. You can even do this with existing strategies. And organizations and hub partners in their own institutions and agencies and organizations can also do this, because here's the bottom line is, if everyone is designing all of their strategies and efforts and budgets and policies to advance equity, it's going to be a whole lot easier to advance equity as a region. And so you want to like embed this and encourage people to apply these tips everywhere retroactively. You know, what are some strategies we're using right now that we might need to think differently about? How can we enhance them, as well as new strategies that you're developing, and have it permeate lots of different places. Okay, any questions on advancing equity, that tip? I realize this is a fire hose, so I appreciate it's a lot. Again, this isn't meant to have you master these strategies. It's to give you an overview and perk your interest so you can go into that toolkit and get more. Okay. Let's do the next one. You ready? I can only see a couple people, so let me try to like look at more people. It always helps me if I can see your faces. Okay, good. Oh, Molly Day is laughing. You're always the person I can look to make yes. Okay, great. All right, here we go. Tip number 4, create self-sustaining solutions. All right, so what does this mean? Let me give you an example of what it doesn't mean. So here is a flyer for an information fair. I picked Minneapolis because it's where I live, just to show this is everywhere. I wasn't involved in this particular effort, but this stuff happens like in every community. So here's my question to you. Why and how is an information fair not a self-sustaining strategy? What do you think? Use the chat. You got to be there, Molly Day says. That's exactly right. That fair will not reach families who couldn't attend, including new families who will move into the neighborhood or the community the day after the fair happens or into the future. Like, it's impossible to reach all families. It's a one and done kind of a thing, right? It's not necessarily that resource information fairs are bad. They're just not self-sustaining. It's a one point in time. So what might a more self-sustaining strategy that's trying to get information about preschool and other things out to families be? How might you reimagine an information fair strategy to be more self-sustaining? Begonia, I don't know if the girl was from Little House on the Prairie. But they're actually, I live actually kind of near that Wilder School, the Laura Ingalls Wilder School. I'll have to go back. Okay, any ideas for how annualized events website? Evan says, yep. What's even more self-sustaining? What would require even less resources and time on your behalf? Website is a good one. Recorded webinars, yep, maybe getting that out. Here's another one that you see in the literature and in other communities, is you partner with other trusted community-based settings, businesses, organizations, salons, faith-based group, WIC offices, bank tellers, people that have natural interactions with families in your priority populations, and you train their staff and set expectations for those staff to share information about preschool or, you know, how to get connected to navigation resources with all the families they see that might have a relevant situation, have children or might be pregnant. And you train them, it's a practice now that will happen into the future. And so once you do it, once you train those staff, set an expectation, they'll keep doing it. And you don't have to keep sharing things over and over again. It now permeates itself. It's self-sustaining. Another example you see all the time, and you saw a lot in the last couple of years, is people get a lot of funding like from ARPA, and they spend all of it on like scholarships for families or on like plugging a hole for wages, let's say, but they don't simultaneously invest some of that money in more self-sustaining strategies that could allow for consistent allocation of resources over time. Like for example, voter-approved children's fund that would get new tax levies or millage to constantly get resources in. That takes some effort to pass one of those things, but it's not going to happen if all the resources are just plugging holes. So this self-sustaining idea is about how do we stop just plugging holes and tiring ourselves out? How do we have self-sustaining strategies that will continue happening and reinforce themselves over time? So 2 design questions you can think about here are, 1, does this strategy we came up with require ongoing effort, staff time, resources from us, from partners, to sustain the changes we're trying to make? And 2, how can we embed that change process into new existing structures, processes, or operations? So Evan mentioned training community still requires FTE or funding. It does, but if you can, I mean, it depends on the type of training, right? So if you're training some staff at these other organizations who will be sharing information like into the future, you do that and then it has dividends. If you're talking about training like putting on a training for childcare workers to try to increase their cultural responsivity, setting that training all the time, quarterly, annually, that's kind of a lot of work. That would not be a self-sustaining strategy. But instead, if you embed that training content into the curriculum of community colleges so that any student graduating from those programs has cultural responsivity skills, that's a more self-sustaining strategy, because you do it once and it continues to self-sustain itself into the future. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's apply this idea of self-sustaining strategy. Again, check out strategy 1. It's getting a little big, but we'll make it even bigger. So this is about, again, designing trainings for both leaders and families that builds their skills to engage together in decision-making, shifts some needed mindsets. It's held in accessible locations, and it's co-designed and co-facilitated by parents. How might you further make that strategy even more powerful by making it more self-sustaining? How would you apply this self-sustaining tip to strategy number 1? So an easy way to do this is you just embed it. You embed it into existing trainings happening in the community, existing orientations. So for example, let's say there's already some trainings going on in the community for parents, maybe about like parent education, positive behavioral interventions or something, whatever it is, positive parenting. How could you work with those groups that are already reaching some families to pull in some of this content so that it's any family that goes through that existing training also has these skills? Or how can you partner with other entities that are already putting out some professional development or training on an annual basis or continual basis? How do you insert these skills, this content into those trainings? In your hub, how do you insert some of this into the orientation that any new hub partner gets, and or like annual kind of professional development that you automatically put on? Like you're baking it in so that's continuing to go. With number 2, you're going to embed those policies so that embed policies to ensure that any decision-making opportunity is accessible. So it's not just a one-time thing. Hey, let's make our next hub partnership meeting more accessible. No, you actually have a policy in the books that requires any new meeting to be accessible. Number 3, again, you're embedding assessment accountability processes, into your operations and embedding outreach practices. So it's not just a one and done thing, but it's like, this is now the way we operate. And finally, you're embedding processes to gather feedback. The like analogy here is, how do you bake it into the cookies so that it's constantly going to naturally happen instead of like doing it yourself over and over again? That's exhausting. Self-sustaining. Okay. Any questions on this tip? We're going to have some time at the end for questions too, if you're just like, right now. So we're going to keep going. Yeah, Evan, go for it.
Yes, my question is more around I think back about the community strategy of training, and then also this one in particular, like embedding it in existing orientation and training methodologies. Like it does presume a level of willingness, I guess, on a lot of partners to let you be involved in like their inner operational procedures. And I think sometimes there's a lot of difficulty breaking through that part. So just recognizing that this is not a strategy where you're going to bat 1,000. Like you're lucky,
Yeah.
we might be lucky to bat like 300. You're a home run hitter if you're getting a third. So I think just for me, contextualizing like what success looks like for this is
Mhm.
kind of important.
So I love, Evan, that you just transitioned us to our last strategy, which is all around implementation. We're going to get there in a second. Before we get there, let's look about taking this live. It's the same thing as equity. You can have people look at their strategies, think about how to make them more self-sustaining, and you can even do this to existing strategies. Same thing. Okay, Evan made the perfect lead-in to our last tip, which is about tending the soil for implementation. This used to be tilling the soil. That was my first word. Oh, tilling the soil. But I have a farmer friend who I was talking about with this, and they're like, tilling actually is sort of out of vogue because they realized if you till it up, if you mess it all up, you're actually disrupting some of the good stuff that's going on. So instead they call it tending. You're doing what's needed, but you're leaving what's working. So tending the soil. I learned something important this time. All right, so too often, this is what it feels like when you have a great strategy and you try to like launch it. It's like planting something in concrete, this poor little plant. So what kinds of things in your own region have acted like concrete for your strategies? Evan just identified one. People aren't bought in. They're like, this isn't part of my job. Why are you asking me to do this? What else gets in the way of carrying out or implementing your strategies like concrete? Molly, yes, there are sometimes shifts in broader policy landscapes that affect it. Funding, trying to work across systems that aren't already aligned. Yep, some of the connection issues, coordination issues. Absolutely. So capacity, perfect. Evan, capacity, strategic misalignment. Shira, old mindsets. Yes, you guys are doing them all. Old mindsets, staff changes. Yep. Okay, you got them all. You're going to see them in a second. So there's a team of researchers who looks at implementation, and they came up with kind of a handy little way to think about what could get in the way of implementation. Here's the types of things you have to consider when you're tending the soil. What could get in the way of people's motivation to implement this? That's what Evan was bringing up. What could get in the way of people's ability to implement this? And what could get in the way of people's opportunity to implement it? They might not even have the opportunity to do it. You can't assume that they will. So here is the golden tip for you today. When you're thinking about what's going to get in the way of these three things, you can think about the same ecosystem conditions that I've like reinforced in your mind 100 times. You're going to have these like tattooed somewhere on your body, because this is the same kind of stuff that gets in the way of implementation as well. What mindsets, like Evan was saying, are getting in the way of people's motivation to carry out this strategy? Lots of times people don't see new practices or changes as part of their job. Why do I have to do this? This isn't part of my role. You have to have additional things added onto your strategy to tend the soil and start building those new mindsets for people to even buy in and say, yeah, let's do this. Do people have the skills or connections they need to carry out that strategy? Sometimes those things aren't always in place. If your strategy assumes that people need to be working together, but there's no current connections or information sharing, that could be a problem. Will organizations have the technology or financial resources to carry out that strategy? If not, how do you address that? Will people have the opportunity to use your strategy given current policies and practices? Usual suspects here are funding rules, rules about how information can be shared. Like there's lots of things that could unintentionally get in the way of people having the opportunity to use it. So bottom line is you have like the ultimate cheat sheet when you're thinking about implementation, when you're looking at what are potential barriers that might get in the way of people's motivation, their ability, and the opportunity to carry something out. This is like your go-to cheat sheet. You can kind of go one by one and think about, to what extent are these things currently helping, so will support implementation, or in what ways will they be stumbling blocks that we need to design additional things into our strategies to like tend the soil. That might have to happen first before you can even get to launching your strategy. This is like anticipating and addressing potential implementation barriers related to this stuff before they happen. So last one here. You're probably like getting so sick of this slide. Look back at strategy 1. It's like very full, but again, this is all about training. What kinds of implementation barriers might you anticipate for this related to people's motivation, their ability, and the opportunity to carry this out, thinking of those different ecosystem conditions? Jillian said, sometimes partners might be trying to align strategies with their individual mission, and it might not always be a good fit. You might need to figure that out, either to have them reimagine their role or even potentially expand their mission so that they can reimagine what this might look like. What else? Yep, time, capacity, desire, absolutely. People might not have time for training like this. How do you design it in a way that's going to be like streamlined into what they're already doing? How do you find, I have a friend who's a researcher out of California. He always talks about finding the slack moments in people's lives to insert this stuff instead of requiring additional obligations. That's brilliant. How do you find the slack moments and embed some of this into them? And Chris, you mentioned the desire. That's again like the motivation, the mindsets, and the capacity. People might in your hub might not have the skills to even design a training like this. Like you might need to partner with other folks who have a specialty in this to help bring some of that expertise in. Okay, bottom line is, with any strategy you design, you cannot assume, like Evan said, that implementation will be like seamless and super easy. You're gonna have to assume that you're gonna hit some rocks. And the way to make sure that those rocks don't totally thwart your efforts is to anticipate them in the beginning, talk with different people who will have a role in this, talk with like top level leaders who are going to be in charge of deciding, is our organization even going to be using this strategy? You need to talk to them and assess like what's their mindset, what's their ability to communicate this. Talk with mid-level managers of organizations who are going to be in charge of getting their staff to do stuff. Are they bought in? Do they know exactly how to describe this strategy and support their staff? Think about frontline staff who might have a role. Like, do they have time? Do they have skills to do what you're asking them to do? Are there other things in their kind of normal environments, policies, practices that are getting in the way? Just really think carefully and talk to different perspectives to try to identify those implementation barriers. And then you don't just stop there, but you continue tending the soil. So once you start actually implementing your strategy, there's going to be new barriers that emerge. People might be bought into your initial phase of your strategy, but whoa, once we get really cooking, I don't feel so comfortable with this anymore. So you might have to continually build new types of mindsets or buy-in as your strategy like kind of scales up or moves out. And so you're constantly looking for implementation barriers to address and build that right into your strategy. The good news is a lot of you have already identified some implementation barriers through your RSA. You didn't even know it, but they're there. And I've read most of them and I saw them. I didn't mention them because I didn't want to freak you out, but they're there. Go back and look. And there's some really important things to keep in mind with your strategies that you might have to deal with as you implement. Okay. So again, as with the other tips, a simple way to infuse this is to just have your hub partners take a couple strategies you're working on and think about how do you anticipate and address implementation barriers? How do you tend to that soil? And you can do that with your new strategies or existing strategies. Okay, so those were the tips. Now, I want you to kind of pull yourself up to an even higher balcony position. So let's say your hub is developing lots of strategies. As they do that, your hub staff, your sort of backbone staff, your hub staff, are going to review those strategies coming up, and you're going to look for additional twofers and chain reactions, opportunities to further align, coordinate, and ensure those strategies are family-centered, and then bring up questions that help your hub partners see those opportunities as well. So you're like constantly looking at what's coming up, and you're using a critical eye to think, are there additional opportunities to use these tips? Or like Raise Up Oregon says, to make sure that they're aligned, coordinated, and family-centered. And then you bring that in and you like help guide your hub partners in seeing those opportunities as well, so they can take needed steps to enhance their strategies. So again, you're sharing those observations with the hub so they can refine them. That's a really important role because each hub partner kind of has like a limited lens, right? They're focused on what they're designing and they don't have that balcony view to see all the strategies. You do. That's a really great role you can play. Additionally, if you think about that cycle, that action learning cycle, as you begin to test out your strategies and kind of use that like fail fast mentality, let's start small, let's test this out, see if it's working, and redesign it if necessary. You're like really being vigilant to figure out what is starting to make a difference and what isn't. And you're updating your plan and potentially your RSA as you learn more, and you're adapting and you're constantly going through this cycle so that your strategies are responsive to what you're learning as well as changes in your context. Okay, so getting really practical, here's that deliverable template that we co-designed like 5 months ago. They changed the colors, but it's the same thing. So here's where it goes. You put your priorities from the RSA into the green bit. You just copy and paste them in. I think all of you most likely have some priorities at this point. You're going to put those strategies you're designing, using those 4 tips, making them as powerful as you can into this sort of teal row. And you're just identifying which root causes from above is that strategy targeting. And then you're creating a work plan with specific activities, at least to start with, to help move that strategy forward. Like Evan said, some of those activities may actually be related to just tending the soil, getting stuff ready. And you can list out, kind of sequence those activities over time to see how that strategy might roll out and some of the people that might need to be involved. Okay. I'm going to do one other content thing, and then we're going to have time for questions. Begonia, oh, yes. I think what you're asking there is, so one of the things I saw is this is just like a little hack. In this little root cause space next to your strategy, instead of actually having to like write out all your strategy, or excuse me, root causes, which can be like kind of a lot of text, just put like the number, like 1A, 2B from the root causes above, and it's just like a little bit easier. Just kind of save some space. Okay, one more thing, and then we'll have time for questions, because I can like see the smoke starting to come out of your ears right now. A word on outcomes. There are 2 types of outcomes that you want to think about with this system strategic planning. The first are ecosystem outcomes, which are directly related to those root causes that we've been strategizing around. Those ecosystem outcomes in turn enable or advance child and family outcomes. But the ecosystem outcomes basically have to happen first. Like we have to shift our systems in ways that will create the conditions and the opportunities for families to thrive. And so there's 2 types. If you you would take a guess at most strategic plans out there, what do they primarily focus on? Which type of outcome? Ecosystem or child and family exclusively? Child and family, ding, ding, Athena got it right. Now, the problem is there's a whole lot that needs to happen in order for those child and family outcomes to change. And there's a lot of assumptions that we make, essentially, if we're just focused on those, by really like layering out, here's how these systems, these ecosystem conditions need to shift over time. You're kind of laying out your like logical argument for what needs to change in order to advance those. So there's two types. A trick for doing the ecosystem outcomes is you flip your flip your root causes into outcomes. So let's say you have a root cause. Many of you had something like this. Many decision-making processes aren't accessible to parents and families. So if that's the root cause, that's what's not working. The outcome is more of those processes are accessible. You can track. Is there a change there? Here's another one. Many K-12 and ECE leaders are not consistently engaging together. What do you think the outcome is? Boom, they are engaging together. It's measurable. You can actually track this. Finally, there's a lack of licensable facilities in the region. As a result of your strategies, there will be more of them. It's a percentage change. And you can anticipate what kind of change can we set for ourselves that's ambitious yet attainable. This leads to the final thing. This is like the final piece, and then we can open it up. Who has ever heard of SMART outcomes? You guys heard of that? So now they changed it. It's SMART-T. So they've added inclusive and equitable at the end. So SMART-Y, specific. Have you clarified the who, what, where in terms of what exactly you want to see change? Measurable. Can you measure it? Can you actually see an observable change? Can you find evidence that this would change in kind of a way that people could agree? Like, is there a standard or an indicator you could use to show that this change has been made? You want to be able to measure it and have people kind of agree, like, yes, this has actually changed. You can define that. Attainable, yet ambitious. So ambitious enough where it's like actually going to move the needle, but attainable and realistic. Relevant. The good news is most of your outcomes will be relevant if they're linked to your root causes, because it's automatically relevant to your RSA and what we've understood about what's contributing to issues. Time bound, you want to kind of make identify what's a realistic time span for this change to happen, given our strategies. It could be however long you need it to be, and that can change as you learn more. You can adjust that. Inclusive, are you including a diverse range of perspectives in defining this outcome? And equitable, are you considering any unintended consequences that might come about as a result of this outcome, and how do you take that into account when you even define it? SMART-Y, there's this sweet little worksheet in your toolkit that brings you through each of these different elements, like different questions, and you can do that for any of your root causes that you're targeting. Note that in addition to outcomes that are directly related to your root causes, there may also be kind of natural byproduct outcomes that will emerge from your strategies. So for example, let's say, go back to that strategy number 1 around the training. You're embedding training for parent leaders and system hub partners, system leaders. As a natural byproduct of that strategy, you might create additional partnerships, or you might create new kind of information sharing processes. You can kind of anticipate those, even though it's not like the direct focus of the strategies. It might just sort of happen naturally. You can track that stuff because it's important often for like general capacity building in your region. And it's really nice to share with funders that those additional outcomes are happening. So kind of think outside the box with the range of different potential outcomes that might come about from your strategies, and you can define them all as SMART-Y. Okay. Those outcomes in that template, there's a couple tables at the end. Systems change outcomes related to your root causes go in the blue section. Child and family outcomes go in the goldenrod section. And again, those child and family outcomes are most likely going to be more long-term, although there might be some initial changes that happen in shorter term. Okay, woo, that was it, guys. I'm gonna stop sharing for a moment. And now we have about 15 minutes for you to ask questions. I can go back and pull up any slides you want, and we can just talk about any questions or new ideas that you're having based on what we've talked about. Let me ask you this, are your hubs using, oh yeah, Shira, go ahead. Sorry, I can't resist. Go ahead, Shira.
Hi, thanks. I guess, so one of the questions that's coming up for me is, how many meetings would you envision this to take place over? Like, I'm imagining that the bulk of this work is being done in our governance meetings. But also there's so much other stuff to cover in there.
Yep.
So I'm just trying to figure out like how much of dedicated time for this, and then also for as ourselves as leaders, like how much of that work would be just us behind the scenes.
Good question. So, I mean, there's different ways to do this, right? And it kind of depends on what your hub partners are willing to do. But I could imagine having a full like governance council meeting, or like in one of your subcommittees or the parent council or whatever, have a meeting where you kind of lay some of this stuff out. And, you know, maybe you pick a couple tips, kind of lay out the process, you maybe talk about a couple tips, and maybe have people start around one root cause together. And then maybe you have people break out between meetings, say, hey, there's a lot to cover here. So why don't people, this is one way, guys, I'm not saying this is how you get to do it, but you could have hub partners pick a root cause, have a couple of them pick a root cause together, and they meet behind the scenes and they come up with some ideas. And then you share them at the next hub meeting. So like there can be some of this work that happens outside of your scheduled meetings that your hub partners can kind of do on their own. You could maybe help facilitate that if they want, or they can just do it and bring the ideas back to you. If you don't have that many meetings, like some hubs meet quarterly, that's not going to be enough. So you're gonna have to think creatively about how to kind of meet in between. You know, there could also be kind of like an integration. So maybe some root causes you give to the parent council, some root causes you give to another subcommittee, and they each kind of do it in parallel. And then you bring them all back to the hub governance council. You know, there's a million ways you could do this. I think the bottom line is for many of your hubs, you don't meet often enough to have enough like actual ideation time for people to think about this. There might have to be some outside of your meetings, and you can negotiate that with your hub partners. How, okay, here's a question on my end. How do you think it will go sharing these tips with your hub partners?
Begonia will have to fact check me on this, so we'll see how aligned we are. I think people will be excited about having the framework. You know, I think when we engage in this conversation, the root cause analysis stuff, people really kind of are willing to dig into it. I also expect there will be trepidation from them in terms of well, what does this mean for the work that we're currently engaged in that we really care about, that we know you guys are already kind of up to your eyeballs in capacity? And what does this mean? And there's a lot of things that we don't want to see go away because we feel like they're incredibly important for the outcomes we're seeking. And then two, this feels like really big work, and many of our partners are engaged in other kind of regional assessments and root cause work in different ways. And so it's like I could see them feeling like, how does it fit in with all those other pieces? That's
Yep.
kind of one reaction that I could see. And Begonia, what's your sense?
I think that you are missing one piece that's accurate. I think that you are missing the piece that we hear from our community, like it's very impossible, really hard for them to just pick or rank 3 or 4, plus the fact that they do not want to be part of something that has to be started from scratch. They want us to come up with something and then go back to them and continue the discussion. But they do not want to face a process that is going to take months to come up with a regional assessment. That was loud and clear.
So here's a couple ideas based on what you guys just said. Evan, you said, man, there's a lot of other stuff going on in the region. And people might think like, how is this possibly connected? That can be part of your job. Your role is to find out what else is going on in the region that's linked to your root causes. And how do you sort of compile them? You are the compiler, because this system strategic plan can actually reference other strategies that are going on that you're playing a role in helping to align and coordinate. So I think that's one way to help create that like linkage. The other, Begonia, you're like, oh, people, this is like so common. Drives me nuts. People are like, just tell me what to do. Show me the strategies and we'll like say yes or no. Like, oh my gosh, what like boring work is that? So here's one way to circumvent that is I know many of you identified current strategies in your RSA that are addressing some of your root causes. Pull those out and have people go through the 4 tips. How do we make those strategies even more powerful? Because I guarantee you there are ways to make them even more powerful. And people will start to realize, these might not be sufficient to really make the changes that we want. So you can, like Begonia, you can kind of set this a little bit. So like bring in some of the strategies that are already there, have them critique them, essentially expand them. And then ask questions like, are there additional strategies we might need to add on to focus on this root cause that aren't already a part of our current, whatever. I think many of you would be in the same boat as Begonia and Evan. Like, I know there's a lot of strategies already going on. Just like link them in. You can kind of create a crosswalk. We started doing this in some of the results. I remember helping you guys summarize. You can just kind of link in where the current strategies are focused in your root causes and go from there. And Begonia, you said one other thing that like people don't want to just deal with a couple root causes. I mean, you can phase this out. Whenever people are overwhelmed, always just think about sequencing and prioritizing. So where do we want to start? In the next 6 months, maybe we just choose a couple of root causes, get some strategies there, and then 6 months from now, when we kind of have a breath, or even a year from now, I mean, it's all arbitrary. It's all for you, right? You get to decide this. Then focus on some additional root causes. You just layer this in at whatever pace your hub can handle, knowing that it's all going to build towards eventually kind of the right stuff. Kelly, what do you think? What's your thought?
What I'm looking at is I'm going back to the work plan that my hub board has been working on and just updating regularly. It's a pretty living document, and we added root causes to it last year. We added the RSA themes last year. So we just keep on, we've kept adding it. And so I can't start over. I need to build on what they've already done. And so the place I'm going to start with, what I hear you saying, I'm going to start with looking for those common root causes across the work plan. And because my board didn't choose only objective 2.1. So that's where I'm starting. I'm starting with the common themes of root causes across our existing work plan and seeing if I can, I don't know if that's building backwards or
No,
what.
I think it's a great approach. I
Okay.
mean, it's great. I mean, here's the other thing is like the system strategic plan deliverable is bounded to objective 2 just to keep your lives manageable. So that you don't have to be like filling out a bunch of stuff for your entire scope of work. That would take you months. Hillary's not into that. But that doesn't mean that the rest of your work isn't already happening. So Kelly, if you already have a work plan and a plan going, use that, because that's what people are already doing. Just extract from that any strategies that are specifically around the root causes for objective 2 and put that in your deliverable. Boop, you hand that in, that's you're done. But for your actual work, I mean, these tips and this whole approach is not about a deliverable, guys. Who cares about the deliverable? It's about doing better work. And so any ways you can like infuse this in to what your hub is already doing. You all are doing really good work already. These tips just like kind of bring it to the next level, so to speak. And you're probably already using many of these tips, but it's just reminding people so that it's consistent and it's kind of infused throughout. But use what's already working, right? Appreciative inquiry. Use what's already working. Just extract that easily for the deliverable. But keep kind of the bulk of your work going forward and just see ways to align and keep it really targeted and focused on the root causes that matter.
My focus is going to take these tips back to our board. We'll have an in-person work session in August, and we will work through the tips, and then my focus with them is not going to be on the deliverable. I'm going to extract the deliverable at it, right?
That's
Am
right.
I okay?
That's
Okay.
right. Totally. That's
Okay.
behind the scenes. Like none
Thank
of your
you.
hub partners should see that deliverable. Ugh, boring. No way. That's your job.
So
Your job is to fill that out, right?
just one thing, when we presented this thing to them, we actually did not manipulate who was in the breakout rooms, right? So we just split people, and then we realized, and look at Evan smiling, we realized that there was like a group 1, there was a heavy representation of early intervention, and group 2 had a heavy representation of school promise providers. And then the strategies that the root causes that they picked were clearly connected to them instead of looking at the broad picture. So you will have to do something to avoid that thing.
So maybe that goes back to defining what this is about in the beginning. It's almost like setting a group norm or a working agreement that through this strategic plan, we're going to work to create collective cross-sector strategies to address root causes that are affecting everyone's work. This is not about an individual organization. This is about us working collectively to address this stuff. There's like unique roles that individual organizations can play in that, but the strategy itself should be collective, not just like, you know, and if you define that in the beginning, get everyone on the same page, then if people start pulling shenanigans like that, Begonia, you can go back to the definition and be like, oh, remember, we defined this in the very beginning that this is about collective cross-sector strategies. So instead of like housing this strategy within your organization, how can you instead clarify the role your organization could play in a larger strategy across the region? Something like that.
I mean, there's also just a natural inclination, like if that's where your wheelhouse is, that's where your focus is, and you get people together in that space, that's what they collectivize around. So it's not like malintent. It's just, you know, it is what happens.
What they do.
And I think I agree. I liked your call out about, you know, it's about putting these outcomes in there and working towards them instead of being hyper focused on like the widget counting or outcome element right this moment. It's about developing that pathway of learning and thinking. And so I think for us, it's starting to implement this and also about feeling like super pressure for there to be some kind of hard due date for this to be done. I think we need to do a lot of forming around the restructuring and give ourselves some grace to get it set up right and to be tend the soil right and then move from there, as opposed to expecting deliverables just to be churned out a year from now across like a whole host of root cause issues.
Yep. So just keep it feasible, right? You know, like there's no expectation that you're going to have strategies for every single root cause you've prioritized. Just make a start, you know, and then you're going to constantly build onto that as the work unfolds. Athena, we got 2 minutes. What's your thought?
I think just the biggest like barrier that I'm thinking of right now is just the capacity of our partners at this time. Like we're talking about you know, even some of the small deliverables we've really struggled with our partners right now saying, you know, we have all these other deliverables, like our capacity to do anything additional or to take on any additional work is super limited. And so trying to navigate that piece of it, I think is where we are going to need to be the most creative.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that goes back to, okay, so there's this idea coming out of organizational change and like change management called small wins. And the idea is you pick changes that are small enough that no one can say no. Like they'd feel like a fool if they said no. They're small enough things, you just get people to start. You know, pick one area maybe, have people strategize, and where people start to really sweat is when you get to the work plan. Because then it's like, who's doing what? That's where you can be super creative and good at facilitating group processes. So when it comes time to figuring out what are the action steps for moving this forward, you break them down into such small action steps that people will be like, well, yeah, okay, I guess I can do that. I can send an email to some people. I can, you know, do this or whatever. You like break it down. And as people just start taking those tiny baby steps, over time, momentum will build a little bit and they'll realize, oh, it actually isn't that big of a deal to take some stuff. It might take longer, you know, to eventually launch your strategy. But if you got to start super, super small, start super small. It's better than not starting at all. You know, and some of that negotiation can happen in that work plan phase. Okay, I'm gonna call us off today. If you have more ideas or questions or want to like really apply this more to your hub, hop on Tuesday. I'll also just be talking with people on Tuesday about what additional supports you might need to share these ideas with your hub. Like I was thinking at one point of creating some like little mini videos for each tip, like a 3-minute video or something for each tip. I don't know if you would use that. Like I need some feedback from you to co-design additional supports you might need to share this back with your hub. So if you're interested in any of the supports, come Tuesday, because I got like 2 more weeks to crank out any additional supports for you. And I want to make sure they're the right supports. Okay. Okay. It was really fun to be on with you today. Thanks for all your 3 minutes. Yes, Kelly, 3 minutes is most people's attention span. It was really nice talking with you, and just it's been a pleasure working with all of you this past 1.5 years. So thank you for being such fun partners in this work, and I hope our paths continue to cross after June.